Hey, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Murthy, Tracy, Matt, thanks for our voice of God for taking on Murthy's last name. I now no longer have to go and say, it rhymes with awesome. So in this panel, we're going to be talking about IoT, and so the Internet of Things that enables the smarter bridging of digital, physical, and human spheres by adding data capture and communication capabilities to objects in a secure way in a networked environment. And so for some of us in the room, this concept around IoT is related with consumer electronics and the consumer applications, ranging from wearables like this one, to entertainment systems, to things like smart thermostats. Others are going to look at the IoT from a business and society perspective, so perhaps in a medical or a healthcare environment, per se. We're just going to add that out there. Or from things like smart parking, transportation optimization, track and trace, and sort of in the logistics around transportation networks. And then there's industrial things in a more industrial context. So you think about gas and logistics and manufacturing. So these are very different ways of looking at the IoT, and what it means depends on whom you ask and how. So I think the fun in this panel is we're going to ask some questions about the perceptions about IoT and what does it mean to you, and how does your perspective flow into this. So as we introduce each of you, introduce yourself, if you would, tell us about how your organization thinks of the Internet of Things. What opportunities does that open up for your organization? And Matt, I'll start with you.
My name is Matt Tarasio, as was mentioned, and I'm the Director of Intelligent Technologies, Analytics and Sustainment. It's a mouthful, but essentially what we do is we cover things like health management of complex machines. In this case, for us specifically, helicopters. It's an incredibly complex machine. In fact, I think it was coined a flying fatigue machine because it likes to shake itself apart when it flies. And we try to prevent that from happening for obvious reasons. That wouldn't be good for our customers if that happened. And we try and do that in a very affordable way. So we collect data from our fleet of helicopters across Lockheed Martin. It's also fixed-wing aircraft, submarines, space vehicles, you name it. So we collect data, state parameters for the aircraft. So that'd be things like just speed. It would be maneuver angles. It would be outside air temperature, that type of things. But also we have what's called a health and usage monitoring system, and that monitors accelerometers placed around the aircraft, so things like vibration data we get from that. So we're able to look at that vibration data and actually do some machine learning on it and forecast or predict when things might fail, which is a really important thing, obviously. And so there's a wide range of areas where we collect data. We also collect data from maintainers that maintain the aircraft. Some of those are as basic as handwritten logs. So we've got to be able to use natural language processing to speed that up and ingest that data. But also flight test. We spend a lot of time and energy testing these aircraft before they get out into service. And so we collect, and these are aircraft that are highly instrumented. So typical production aircraft aren't highly instrumented, but these are highly instrumented, so we collect a lot of data. And on our commercial fleet, probably might be wondering how much data are we talking about. So for our S-92, which is a 19-passenger commercial helicopter, we have about 250 to 300 flying around the world at any one time. And we collect around 10 gigabyte per day, so it's not a huge number, but we've been doing it since 2003. So we have on the order of 25 to 30 terabytes worth of data that we have in a Cloudera cluster that we can access rapidly. So we collect data across, and then there's also the factory, right, where we have machines, manufacturing parts, and other things. But that's my focus is more on the platform side.
Very interesting. Tracy, you have a different chassis that Dockbox is looking after. So what's your viewpoint and introduce yourself and about the Internet of Things.
So my name is Tracy Roush. I'm the CEO of Dockbox. And Dockbox is really, what we're building is a platform, a distributed platform for healthcare that allows the integration of medical devices, sensors, human observations, as well as historical data, all to be brought together in one location in order for you to be able to do better data visualization, decision support, smarter alarms, smarter algorithms. But I think one of the key things that we're also looking at is collecting and storing this data actually starts to move us towards a lot of what you guys are doing, of being able to, how does your hospital run and operate using data and decision making for that information as data, but on top of that, how can we then build smarter medical systems and hospital systems for the patient data as we go forward. So we're at a very different phase of this. Healthcare and definitely the IoT in healthcare is in its infancy, as well as data analytics right now is in its infancy, even though we hear a lot of claims about a lot of data that's made available right now in healthcare. We're still really trying to figure out what to do with it and how do you use it and what type of data and structures that we need.
Very nice. Murthy, so we've heard a little bit here on different examples around collection of IoT sources. What's different about IoT? How do you, from the perspective of Informatica? And so if you introduce yourself and give us a little bit of a viewpoint on that.
Absolutely. So my name is Murthy Prakasam. Thank you for the reminder of what it rhymes with. But I'm a director of product marketing of big data and IoT at Informatica. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with Informatica, we're a software company just like Cloudera. And we've partnered with Cloudera for many years. So we've been around about 20 years. We are the industry's #1 provider of data management solutions. So to define what that means and relate that to IoT, basically the idea is most of data processes are fairly repeatable and unfortunately very manual today. And so we've always been in the business of automating those manual tasks. So ideally we want to get you to process more and more data with the least amount of people so that you get more leverage. And so, and we've done this for 20 years, so starting back in the relational database days all the way now, of course, the last couple of years more focused on things like Hadoop and data processing in the cloud. IoT is very interesting. First, I think even the phrase is kind of fascinating. Like it's some of these words, Internet of Things. It's about as generic as you could possibly make it. It's sort of interesting how that phrase took off. But I think the reason it took off was because it is so applicable across so many use cases. So as you're talking about, there's use cases around public well-being. There's the industrial applications. Some of the other use cases that we've worked with the public sector on are preparedness, which can mean things like military, homeland security. There's obvious data sets there of interest that people would want to be analyzing very quickly. There's also actually a lot of very operational, sort of not so exciting type of projects, but just things like processing transaction data faster, catching fraud. The public sector deals with very high volumes of data. So broadly speaking, to get to your question of what is Internet of Things, I actually view it as a very natural evolution of everything we've been doing over the last couple of years, but it's just focused on a little bit faster velocity. And the velocity will also lead to higher volume, because if you're doing more and more data quickly, then it leads to more data, of course. But it really is, and I think this is why the phrase is so generic, Internet of Things, because it really can be anything from the consumer type of data to other sorts of data sources that people are just trying to get insights as quickly as possible. And obviously the military and security type of use cases, it's very obvious why you want to be able to look for patterns quickly, detect and take action. But there's a lot of other types of areas where just, people have kind of taken it for granted that even just basic reporting and analysis takes weeks and months. But what if you could just do it in a day or less than a day? Then there's value there in just speeding up decision making. So in my view, I think Internet of Things is about just getting data as quickly as possible and getting it to the consumers of that information as rapidly as possible. And obviously, we provide software to do that in an even more faster way. So that sort of fulfills the ability and the sort of the mission of Internet of Things.
So Murthy, I notice here that you're instrumented both analog and digitally in your capabilities here. Tracy, we were talking a little bit earlier about this as you're starting to take existing architectures that are out there today. And so the healthcare system, you said the IoT is in its infancy within there. How do you get into that kind of environment to be able to do the type of data collection you were talking about?
So we're directly at the patient bedside. Anybody who's been in a hospital knows medical devices stick around for a long time. So we're having to connect and convert everything from serial connectors to Ethernet, proprietary communication protocols across devices, interfaces of other systems, and in a very complex environment. An ICU patient can have 7, 8, 9 infusion pumps attached to them, as well as a ventilator and a monitor, and having to be able to bring all of that information together is really what we've spent a lot of our time and focus is how you get it. Because the biggest thing I think with the IoT is you can get a lot of data. There's a big difference between collecting a lot of data and actually getting high quality, high fidelity data that actually tells a story. And so you have to focus on the points and the pieces of data collection. I think, as I said, we're in our infancy because we're dealing with what we have now. I think the next step is going to has to be the conversation of, well, what else would I like to have? What other information would I like to collect? Does that mean I need to put some environmental sensors in the room? Do we need to collect another piece of information and data? All by balancing that we want to provide better, higher quality, less complicated clinical care at the same time. So being able to automate it is another challenge that we're dealing with of, the usability and that factor directly at that bedside is extremely important.
Do you see a differentiation between, you mentioned clinical care and then patient care? So the one has the inference that it's going to be within a specific constrained environment. The other one seems to have a larger, broader mandate for the full life cycle of the patient. Do you see both of those in your realm? Yeah,
we see both of those in our realm. I think one of the things is a lot of the world has actually started out in patient care, outside of the hospital information and care. We started in the hospital, and the reasons behind that were, one, it's a much larger, richer data set that's more complex. The other part of it is you're dealing with users. While we figured out these technical pieces, you're dealing with users who are experts. And when you move into the home environment, you have other safety factors that you have to take into account because you don't always have that expert user taking care of that patient. And you also have, for example, is it your weight or is it your dog's weight or is it your kid's weight? If you're measuring those scales, those things had to, have to be worked out also. So we started in the hospital environment due to the richer data set so we could start to build our system out. But I think the way the future of healthcare is going is that the environment's not going to be a factor in the criticality or acuity of patient care. So.
Tracy, you started talking about the sort of real-time nature of this interaction. Matt, when we were talking earlier about Sikorsky and the view that you had off the airframes, you started, I know, operating this in a batch mode, looking at the aircraft performance when it came back. Is that still where you're looking within Sikorsky today and the types of use cases you have?
So we still do that, and that's the primary way that we collect our data off the aircraft. But one of the things that we launched recently, that we worked with one of our customers, PHI, who is an offshore oil operator down in the Gulf of Mexico. So they fly people out to oil rigs and they do search and rescue and other missions down there. They wanted to be able to access information on the aircraft real time. And so we launched something called Realtime HUMS, right? HUMS, Health and Usage Monitoring. And we're not collecting data real time. There's actually a significant cost to being able to access this data via satellite in real time that our customers don't really want to pay that price tag. And you really don't need it all the time. But what it allows us to do, when there's an issue, we can go in and pull any information off the bus, so the data bus that's on the aircraft, any kind of state parameters, anything from the HUMS, any type of vibration data, and be able to make an assessment in real time. And we had an event recently where the pilots were flying. There was an issue on the aircraft. They radioed in. We went on and pulled the data. We did an assessment of the data and provided information back. It's safe to continue the mission. So it was a great example of being able to rapidly look at the data and also have the history of the broader fleet at your fingertips. Because just looking at that data in isolation gives you a perspective on that particular vehicle, but being able to say, is it normal? Right? Is it anomalous, right? Being able to do that rapidly is the key. And so that's why being able to access big data rapidly is super important to the safety of our fleet.
Are there any implications to being able to provide that kind of real-time intervention and advice?
Yeah, so this is something that we struggle with actually. So one of the concerns we have is when a pilot is flying a vehicle like a helicopter or a fixed-wing aircraft, particularly in the commercial world, their guidance is the flight manual. That is the certified standard upon which you must fly the aircraft. So if there's an issue, the answer needs to be consult the flight manual and do what it says in the flight manual. Now, if any of you have seen a flight manual, it's a pretty thick document, and we don't really want pilots to be making life and death decisions based on a very thick document and being able to read off a plot and make these decisions. So one of the concerns we had was from a legal perspective that if we provide guidance and that guidance is wrong or something happens, are we now legally responsible for the outcome? But our customers are fantastic and they really do put safety first. And so they look at that and say, look, that's not an issue. We want to make sure that we operate in the safest way possible, and we'll take that, the legal recourse or responsibility. We really would appreciate the real-time information and ability to react real-time. So it's fantastic. It worked out very well. But that was a legitimate concern for us.
Tracy, sort of a similar question to you as you started to look at the adoption as you start to have Dockbox at the bedside. What are the sort of reactions that you're getting from the clinical staff?
Our reactions from clinical staff have actually been extremely positive, and I think this goes bigger than the clinical staff. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem who's very hungry for data in healthcare, especially this direct patient care data. Everywhere from adverse event analysis that the FDA is wanting to do or other regulatory bodies, all the way back to researchers and patient safety researchers. There's so much that we have that we don't actually understand what happened, how it happened, and once it gets to the point of being investigated, there's so little data that's available to us that we want to start to be able to provide that information and that data because it provides better insight and provides a better way for people to actually make improvements. One of the things that healthcare has been lacking is not only this patient safety data improvement, but also process improvement within the hospital, quality metrics that you can make a change in a process and 2 or 3 weeks later actually see if that change actually decreased the time that you think it did, decreased the information you had. You have an adverse event, say a medical device actually had a failure. Right now that's all paper and usually scattered across a couple of different places, and it's taken us a really long time to actually figure out, historically, figure out if a device is actually failing because of something that's a failure or, if it's a process improvement or change. So actually, the response to this has been actually very positive from our customers. The more, information is power to them, and they can actually start to take control of their, how they're running operations, making data-driven decisions across the entire hospital, not only for clinical, but also hospital operations as well as safety factors.
So Murthy, we hear some challenges here for those of us who are on the support for these kinds of business cases and initiatives. Data's moving in new ways. There's new types of data that's coming on board. We have new access patterns around data, streaming, batch, request, response. Where do you see this going? And how do you help? What's Informatica doing to really push this forward?
It's a very, really exciting time, but also it's a bit of a controversial time too, I think. It's exciting because, you're talking about the consumer, fitness devices. I mean, I don't think most of us even recognize how much stuff is instrumented today. It's so cheap to do it. So the opportunity to collect new data sources, and again, it can be anything from some of the things we're talking about here, in terms of things you can instrument with people, instrumenting machinery. It's amazing, and then being able to turn that into insight very quickly is a huge opportunity. So Informatica offers all the software back end to this. So being able to ingest the data, bring it into a Hadoop cluster, doing data mastering, data governance, data security, all of it is just right out of the box. So that's just work that you don't have to do on a manual basis. But I also think it is controversial, as we've kind of talked about here too. And the controversial aspect of it is, privacy is something that matters, and it's something that I think, it's going to always be an evolving subject. I don't think there's an endpoint to that discussion. I was actually at this event last year. And I was telling folks here, I don't know how many people here know here, if you have an iPhone, it actually tracks every single place you have been to continuously, like while you're walking around with your iPhone. So for example, if I want to know how many times I've been in Washington, D.C. the last 10 years, or as long as I've had my iPhone, I guess, it actually has been tracking that. And you can go into, there's an app where you can go in and actually look on a map, and it will show you physically where you've gone. Now, presumably that's being used in some way to benefit your experience and make the iPhone more useful, but it's a little controversial, and you wonder also, I mean, when you go to shopping malls and stuff like that, like they keep telling you about all these sensors that are like kind of following you around. And so when you get into like the healthcare domain or the defense and security domains, on one hand, data is very exciting, but there's some issues that are controversial as well, and it's worth recognizing that up front. And I think that's actually, frankly, where people should be spending your time. You shouldn't be spending your time on data integration and data quality and data mastering. We've got solutions for that. It's the stuff that, it's a pattern, it can be repeated, and we can solve that part of it. The technology should never be the hard part. The hard part is getting around some of the controversial aspects of the data and how the data is going to be used, how it's going to be accessed, what data should you even be collecting in the first place. And I think that will never be a conversation that ends. It always evolves. And our cultural acceptance towards what we're okay with being collected and accessed also evolves as well.
Very true. So I'm going to pivot the conversation a little bit because we're talking about the data quite a bit. And that's great. And we've got data collection and we've started to formulate how that happens. But obviously, we have to make data useful. And one of the big topics that we hear, especially around, if we mention big data in one sentence and IoT in the next sentence, it would be criminal for me not to mention Agile as the third sentence to combine those three very hyped topics together. Do you ascribe to that sort of Agile philosophy about working with data? And if so, how do you do that within each of these organizations? Matt, I'll start with you.
So we absolutely embrace Agile, but it's been a journey, and it's interesting. So I'm an engineer, and there's always supposed to be a battle between engineers and IT. It's just the way that the world is set up. And that was a struggle, particularly for my analytics team that was developing software and running projects in a very agile manner. But the way to proceed and make it work is you just show the results, right? You see the old approach where it's requirements and it's all sequential, and by the time you get to the end, the requirements have changed because it's taken you so long to get something done, versus the agile approach where you accomplish something and get something done along the way and you iterate and evolve. It's a way better way to proceed, and so what I've noticed is, kind of legacy institutions or big companies have started to embrace it more and more, and you see that, and I can speak for Lockheed Martin as a whole, it's embraced across the entire corporation. IT, throughout the entire business areas, we're embracing it more and more. And so I'm excited. It's when you can deliver results faster, I mean, that's what it's all about, right? So we absolutely embrace it, and my team has taught me a lot about it, right? More so than I knew maybe 4 years ago. So.
Any specific learning that came out of this that was, or an education that was provided to you by your team?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, I think that most people like to think of a problem sequentially, and from, say, more of a aircraft design process, both military and commercial side, where you spend a long time, say, on the military side, doing an AOA or analysis of alternatives. You come up with a request for proposals. That request for proposals goes out to the different contractors. They put in designs, and then the design gets built on or designed on paper, and then you order parts and you flight test, and it's a very long process. In fact, for a military, say, helicopter, that could be 20 years, right? And so that is the kind of the standard that was in place, and to a large extent, it's still there today, and that's kind of on the hardware side. software gave us the ability to really look at things in a more agile way. And so that's what I took a lot of learning away from the software development cycle, because my background was in kind of more of the aircraft design side.
Got it.
So I took a lot away from that, and that's where a lot of my learning was. And I can definitely see the benefits, and I think there's benefits on the hardware side too.
Tracy, same question to you as far as Agile and how you view that and embrace that within Dockbox.
We wholeheartily embrace it, although we do have the challenge that we operate in the regulated medical device space in that sector. So we have to balance that between maintaining a very good quality system, maintaining very good quality documentation, and still operating in a very agile way. And the way we've done that is actually through taking our platform and being very modular with our platform. So we're tackling specific problems in specific modular pieces. So it's acceptable. From a data perspective, we're we've been very agile in the fact that we're learning very quickly of what questions do we want to ask, what information do we have. So our information model, our underlying structure has actually changed very quickly in that agile model approach. And one of the things that it's really come down through is in the IoT space, what you have with real-time dynamic data and how it's structured is actually a little bit different than how you would store it in a larger storage data cluster of what you need. There's additional information you need to have to go back and look at things historically versus how we traditionally said, okay, we're going to pull data from one or two devices, run an algorithm, and this is going to tell us what it needs. Well, you store that data and go back and look at it 2 weeks later and try to figure out what that actually said. They're not always quite the same. So we've actually been pretty agile in how we design that through through the complete cycle of building it, implementing it, collecting data, analyzing that data back, that cycle across. And I think that cycle in healthcare is going to happen for a long time, and we have to promote that agile approach to data analysis and data collection to get where we want to go.
Yeah. Well, Murthy, I hear this a lot in what Tracy was just saying there, that sort of evolution of a model as you're starting to take the raw data to a transformed state in there. Do you see that as well?
Absolutely, and it's interesting, Agile is another one of those phrases that's taken off in the industry, just like Internet of Things and big data, but I think there's another good reason for that as well. If you look actually at most of our most successful public sector and private sector customers, one of the consistent best practices is the use of Agile methodologies. And why that is, I think, is there's a couple of reasons. It's this sort of mysterious enzyme that brings balance to a lot of conflicting forces. So one is what you'd mentioned, the conflict between the engineering side and the business side of trying to focus on what you're doing versus getting something kind of done. So Agile has this ability to get you quicker results and to test things along the way. That's super important, especially in domains where you don't necessarily know where you're going up front. And so you might have a very loose set of requirements and you have to kind of evolve as you go along. So the Agile concept is very good for that. But it's also a great way to go back to a previous point for kind of balancing this tension between the opportunity of Internet of Things and the controversy that's associated with it. Because one way to get over some of the political hurdles is to show some quick results and say, look, the world didn't blow up and things are okay, here's what this change might look like, but get that political capital buy-in. And that's very important whether you're in the public sector or the private sector. So the Agile concept is very powerful in sort of balancing these forces. And Informatica embraces it, by virtue of the fact that we automate a lot of the manual tasks. So if the goal is to get to your endpoint and get good data and good information as quickly as possible, the last thing you want to be doing is doing stuff manually. So the more you automate, the more you're using pre-built components, the quicker you can get to results. And that's important not only in terms of the insights that you gain, but all of the kind of political and some of these sort of conflict mitigation type of aspects as well.
Great answer. And again, all of this is really informative to your thought process. When you talked about Agile a little bit, all three of you, in fact, mentioned this concept of experimentation. And that sort of ties back to the ability to enable risk within an organization. That's culture. How do you empower people to take risk? How do you let them know that it's okay to experiment, to pose a hypothesis, and to find the components to build off that? And Tracy, I'll start with you.
I think that knowledge and that ability to take risk is I would say somewhat ironic, but in healthcare, that risk is taken by the clinical staff and the physicians. And I think the biggest thing is we've gotten away from that over the past few years in healthcare of wanting to have things uniform and structured and capabilities, but empowering them and enabling them to have this data and information actually encourages them to start to take that risk again, to be innovative in how they not only developing new technologies, but how they provide care. Healthcare has never been a static thing. I mean, you think about even 10 years ago what we could do versus what we can do now, and where we're going in the future with, more and more the ability to innovate. So, the fact that you want them to be able to take that risk and to do it in a way that's safe for them to go forward and do that, and that's access and availability of data is going to be one of the ways that we can actually enable them to go forward.
And follow on to that is, do you think are there any key performance indicators that you would say organizations can use to measure their level of innovation, their level of ability to experiment and to support that kind of environment?
I think there is. I think there's a couple in a key place. One, if your hospital or your organization is still not, if you're not hearing someone saying, we need to look at this process again, this is the metrics we have to make this process, then you're probably not making those changes, because there's always a better way to do something, and for them to be able to go forward and do that, it's about controlling that of how often you make those changes, predefining what your metrics are and what you have going forward. And I think healthcare is entering in a new phase of where innovation is starting to move very quickly, and it's through for a couple of reasons. One, the fact is that the technology is now becoming available for them to innovate again, and two, it's out of need and necessity to provide higher quality, lower cost healthcare to the world. It's not just it's not a state problem or a country problem anymore, but it's a worldwide problem of being able to do that.
That's a question to you. How do you create a culture that enables that kind of innovation, and how do you measure it?
Well, I think the biggest thing to enabling people to be comfortable taking risks is really, I think it's about culture, right? And you've got to have the culture that demonstrates by example that when you take a risk, measured risk, that it's acceptable to, say, fail, as long as you collect the data and learn from your failure. And I think there's, it's all relative. Not every risk is equal, of course. And so one thing we wouldn't encourage is for someone who's very junior to be put in a position to take a large risk with limited experience on a very large program. That would be somewhat silly of the management at the company. But that being said, I think in the R&D world, that's a great area where you should be pushed to take larger risks. And so setting up organizations like at Sikorsky, we had something called Sikorsky Innovations. Lockheed is famous for the Skunk Works. Those kind of companies are set up in order to push the envelope. And there's an expectation that you will be spending R&D funds in areas where there is a lot of risk and you may not get the outcome that you desire. But along the way, and that's a cultural thing that's accepted. And so I think there's ways to drive the culture, and it does come from example. If the person at the top does not embrace the culture, that flows down very rapidly. And you certainly see a culture that embraces risk and manages it well, versus a culture that is very afraid to do anything outside of the box at all. And you see that they go out of business very rapidly. And there's many examples in history of that. And I think the other question was the KPIs.
Yeah, are there metrics? Or how do you measure an innovative culture?
That's interesting. I was thinking about this a little bit a few weeks ago. How do we measure failures or the appetite to take risk? And I think it's a tough one. One of the things that you can do, of course, is look at something like an R&D portfolio and identify how much of that portfolio was spent in areas that were really kind of pushing the envelope and did not achieve their goals. And I think that perhaps it might be a target where you actually set up an environment like that. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agencies, has a goal, and I'm going to get this incorrect, but there is an expectation that I think it's 1 in 3 will actually succeed, or 1 in, I can't remember the exact ratio, but that's a goal at the company where, you know, if you're not pushing the envelope, so they only accept projects where there is there's a small chance that it might succeed, but they expect to see programs not move forward because they push too far. And if you don't see that, then perhaps they're not pushing too far. So that's maybe one way.
If you're not failing, you're not trying?
Exactly, right? And I think that's DARPA's motto, right? Is that you're not trying hard enough. Right? So I think that's a great way to proceed too.
Murthy?
Yeah, so I agree, obviously, it's very much related to culture. And I think of culture in sort of it's the classic, you know, people, process, technology. And the technology side is where we come in from Informatica. Obviously, the Agile stuff we talked about in the previous question is very relevant. The quicker you can ship stuff, that inherently reduces risk also and builds confidence. The other aspect of this is collaboration. So one of the other things that I think a lot of times gets people into trouble is when you kind of do things in a silo and you haven't been able to show results or get other departments and functions involved. Anytime, you know, having more and more people involved up front is a way to get everybody on the same page quicker, and that itself reduces risk in a lot of ways. And our solutions actually facilitate that. So you actually have workflows and you have ways of getting people from different functions to use the exact same data and do the data management collaboratively. It's a very unique differentiator for us. If you look at the other two sides of the people and the process, on the process side, I think metrics are important. I've heard clients of ours who've said that they had everything set up, technology was great, they were using us and everything, but they had the wrong metrics put in place, and that tanked the project. So having the right metrics and making sure you think that through is very critical, because you know, if you don't measure the right thing, you're not gonna get the right outcome. The other aspect of that also is training and communication. So this is the other aspect, you know, of Internet of Things. There's all this new data. People may just not know what to do with it. And I think we take it for granted, especially those of us who are in the data world, that it's so obvious. If you had all this data, it'd be great. But for people who don't understand what the insights are that come out of it, they just may not be trained to deal with it. And so there's a sort of communication beyond your core data team to the people who are going to be consuming it and who are affected by it, and making sure they're bought in as well. The final aspect, you know, on the people side, and this might be a bit of a controversial thing to say too, but one of the things I've personally observed when I look at our most successful customers, the personalities of these people are a little odd. You know, there is an inherently courageous and creative and risk-seeking personality that I think goes after some of these projects, and they're willing to tough it out through some of the political challenges, through the technical challenges, or whatever the obstacles that may come through. And so, as you think about staffing also, look for maybe some of the more, on the edge type of people, who may be more excited about doing something creative, who are more risk-seeking, because it's always going to be hard somewhere. Whenever you're trying to do something new and innovative, there's always going to be obstacles, and there are certain people who are just awesome at plunging through and getting to the other end, and we all know people like that. And so I think that's another aspect of staffing these projects, is getting those kind of risk-seeking, little off-the-wall type of people, because they're the ones who will get you to those first couple successes, and before you make it maybe more and more mainstream.
Very interesting. Hire for quirky.
Quirky is a good word too, yes.
In the job description. So we're sitting here in Washington, D.C. What would you advise government agencies to learn from these use cases and our experiences around working in IoT, around driving things off of sensors and things? And I'll sort of open this up to the couch-ish and chair.
Couch-ish.
I think I would challenge him to think about the fact that to remember that data can be used for more than one reason and more than one way. And so to think outside the box of how you can use and leverage the data that you currently have and the data that you would want to have. Pretty much all of data is going to have multiple uses. and you shouldn't be afraid to ask, hey, can we use this piece of data for these other 3 things to figure this out? The path to getting answers is not always a linear path. It's kind of a winding trail, and you actually usually find the extra stuff and the cool and interesting things. And that actually did happen inside of Dockbox. The biggest value add is actually not from the primary use of the data. It's from the secondary uses that we're finding throughout the hospital, but for other factors, I'm sure that's the case across the board. That to ask the question, can we look at this from a different perspective, is always, I think, the right path to go, because there's usually something there.
One thing that I think would be very helpful, and one thing we struggle with, is our customers on the government side, they own all of the data. And they have access to all of this great data. And sometimes there's a desire to keep that in-house and not share that data. And so I think liberating the data, making it available, I think together we could do some pretty amazing things, and we've collaborated on a number of things. But there is definitely a kind of a standoffish thing of, if I make that data available, what could you do with it? And I think we've got to get past that and say, the data's there, and then put the challenge on industry to say, what can you do with that data to help us achieve our mission and help us achieve our goals? And I think we're getting there slowly, but there's definitely we have all this data, we know it's valuable, we're not quite sure what to do with it, but we know that we probably shouldn't give it to you, because if we give it to you, then we're not sure what you will do with it. I think we've got to get past that. So that's one thing I would encourage our partners on the government side, and also adopting Agile. It's been a struggle internally for us to adopt Agile, and so having gone through that pain, I know it's a painful process, but to become more agile, I definitely think is beneficial to society in general. Right?
I would say there's 2 things that I would leave as final words. One is, and not to make like a political comment or anything, but one of the things I was just personally inspired by in the former administration was, Vice President Joe Biden ran this program around the cancer moonshot, and a lot of that was based on data. And I think, so the first lesson I think is, don't be afraid to dream, and don't be afraid to look for a moonshot, because a lot of the things you might think are moonshots are actually feasible now. Technology's there, and a lot of it is more around the politics and some of the things that we've talked about here, but don't be afraid to dream, because a lot of the things that may have seemed impossible 4 or 5 years ago are entirely feasible, and it's literally just a matter of somebody like yourselves going for it. And so don't be afraid to dream, because there's a lot that can be done, and a lot that people haven't even thought about doing yet. The second thing I would say is the flip side of that, which is, don't go into the dream without being cognizant of the practicalities of how you get there. And we've talked a lot about that, the politics, the training, the communication, staffing with the right people, privacy considerations. And all of these are fairly well established. And so, working with the right partners, you can become, the probability of your success and of achieving your dream can be significantly higher as well. But it all starts with the dream, and it's great to see that kind of innovation in the public sector, and certainly we hope to see even more moving forward.
Great. Any final words of wisdom as we wrap up our panel? Ye who have done sensors, you have incorporated them in, you've instrumented our human experience to make it better, have a better clinical experience. You've made it safer for us to travel in helicopters and other military aircraft. What would you say?
Final thing, I think the movement into the world of autonomy, which we're embracing heavily, I think is incredibly exciting for the future. So data, the volume of data and the speed of the data that we're getting in is going to increase rapidly, and that's going to really shake to the core, and it is in cars and other things, but it's going to shake to the core how we do things moving forward, particularly with regulations. And I think that the technology will outpace the regulations. I think but it's an exciting area, And we're all going to be flying on completely autonomous fixed-wing aircraft across the Pacific and other things in the future. We're going to be driving autonomous vehicles, or maybe not driving autonomous vehicles, I guess. But it's going to give you time back to your life, which I think is going to be amazing. Safety is going to increase. And so I'm all in to embrace autonomy as we move forward. I think it's a very exciting thing. So that's something I'm very excited about. And it's just going to rapidly increase the amount of data that we see coming off vehicles in general.
I think actually, to get to his point, I think the changes you are going to see in healthcare are going to mimic the other industries. You're going to see autonomy that starts to occur. You're going to see what a patient care environment is actually going to fundamentally change, and what the data and the information we have available to us is going to fundamentally change. The way we do things now won't be. The information will actually show that we could do things a lot better than we're currently doing, and it's coming. And I think, we shouldn't exclude healthcare from the rest of the world of looking at the IoT and the other aspects of it, of, autonomous systems and intelligent systems, and the fact that that's really the future.
Right. Murthy.
Just to reiterate, don't be afraid to dream. Find your data moonshot.
Great. So, to the panel, I thank you very much for your participation. This has been great. Please, a round of applause, please.